You're absolutely 100% recording. So many noises in life, and you don't know what they are until you start recording stuff. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Neff learns Flair and tells stories, in which I learn Flair and tell you stories. So here we go. So for those of you who have been watching, you know that we've done some tin flares, we've done some bottle stuff, we've done some spoon stuff. So I'm going to kind of mix it up, but like I said, we're going to see some of the stuff you've seen before, and I'm going to bring new stuff every time. And while we're doing that, to help me kind of focus on it, I'm going to tell you a story. This is my 25th anniversary as a bartender, which means 25 years, and because of that, I've been kind of going back through all the places that I've worked, back to the beginning of what my career was, and I've been talking a little bit about, not necessarily my experience in it, but my experience in what the world was like as far as cocktails and bars go. So we talked about Seattle, and those are my early days, and we're going to talk about New York tonight. That's a long story, and we won't be able to cover all of it, so it's going to be kind of strange. Either way, that's what we're going to do, and here we go. So many noises. What I'm hoping is that as I practice the stuff that I've been practicing before, I will improve. And as I improve and get these things into my hands, I will start to be able to kind of combine them together, because I haven't done this before, at least not in a formal sense, and it's been kind of fun. So I appreciate y'all watching. As far as the new stuff, I've just been kind of trying to rotate through. So what I'm going to do today is something that wasn't in a tutorial, but I'm going to keep practicing this over-the-shoulder thing. You got to get a spin on it, because you don't want it to be all wobbly like I'm doing it. I think, I'm going to want to try it on both sides and make sure that I can, boom, just like that. I want to make sure it does that every time. So as I'm telling you this story, I'm going to be kind of flipping back and forth between these things. And yeah, here goes. When did I start? Let's start with this one. So I left Seattle in 2000 to go to okay, that was farther than it usually goes. I gotta go get it. Bugger. So I left Seattle in 2000, and I decided I wasn't going to be a bartender when I moved to New York. I was going to be a writer. And that one almost got away from me. I got a job as a writer, and it took a very short amount of time for me to realize that it was not going to be the kind of grown-up job that I thought it was going to be. I thought being a writer was more grown-up than being a bartender, but I know a little more now. Anyway, I'm not... New York itself is its own story. You know, I can't cover that in anything that is the length of time anyone would watch it. I don't know why anyone would want me to. I will say this. New York also didn't teach me Flair. I will say that the city itself taught me a lot. The bar culture in New York is relatively unique in that it both has a lot of bars in it, and people who live there live in places that are like this big. It's a tiny little island, 2 miles by 12 miles, and you know, even in places like Brooklyn, which are bigger, people are used to being in spaces that aren't huge. Because of that, there are bars everywhere, because it's the social clubs where everybody goes. If you have someone to come visit you, if you want to meet up with a friend, you're more likely to not have them in your apartment or your house, because your house usually isn't set up for that. It's usually set up just for you to live there with you and your family, or by yourself. So it was way less common for people to celebrate in their homes. They would celebrate in bars and in restaurants. So people, just as a society, use bars differently in New York, because there's one on the corner. It's really very much a neighborhood thing, and you kind of knew your neighbors and they knew you, because that's how everyone kind of contextualized what it is to be in their specific part of the city. And that was a huge lesson for me. And it brings me to a point that I brought up in the past, which is after a certain point, your best teacher is your clientele, because you have to learn how to take a disparate group of people and make them have the same intention. To run a neighborhood bar, which effectively a lot of bars in New York were, you have to kind of be able to get a feel for the neighborhood and give the neighborhood what it wants. It doesn't have to do with stuff. It's not like saying everybody wants Miller Lite, say, or everybody wants craft beer, or nobody drinks bourbon, or whatever it is they say at the time. Allowing yourself to get into the head of your clientele and realize that you are part of the neighborhood too, so their intentions and their needs are your intentions and your needs. So it takes a while to really kind of understand where it is you work, around whom you work, and after a while, your clientele really teaches you how to contextualize your bar. The thing that I learned from bars like that was that you have to be open. And it's not about you so much as it is about you as a part of the group. And you have to be part of the group, otherwise how are you going to lead a community? I mean, that's what bars are for, and you really realize that when you work in any kind of neighborhood bar, certainly one that is so tied up in its neighborhood like you get in neighborhoods in New York. I'm going to mix it up a little bit. As a culture of bars is pervasive, and is very much a nature of the city. The interesting thing is when I went to other cities, so I moved from New York to LA, and then from LA to Houston, it wasn't different per se. It was just people didn't have as thorough as an experience in their neighborhoods. They didn't have the same intention as far as trying to provide that community seat. What I found when I went to these places was that the more I tried to bring that kind of New York thing to it, which isn't a New York thing, it's just a thing, the more people would kind of look at the places I was working and say, wait, this feels different than we normally get. I don't want to jump ahead. We'll get to that in a minute. So I moved to New York very much as a country mouse. You know, we knew we were, I say we, there was a bunch of us from Seattle who kind of moved at the same time. What up, Haig? But what we didn't know was that it doesn't matter that we were big fish in our small ponds. We were going to the show. We were going to the big city. And we knew this is where, you know, all the best things were and all the most famous things were. And we didn't know. You know, we didn't know if we had what it took because, you know, we had our way of doing things, and we kind of developed it out in our weird little corner of the country that no one really cared about except for its grunge. And then it's tech, right? But we didn't know that what we were doing would fit into the big city. Boom. This is how showing off works. Turns out it did. So, you know, all of us kind of did some very varying degree of successful thing. And I myself started out working at a very fancy hotel called the Hudson. And it was owned by a guy named Ian Schrager, who I'd never heard of, who was famous for going to jail because of his time at Studio 54, which I had heard of but didn't really kind of understand what the thing was. So, based on that, I got a job down in Tribeca. And ta-da, stick the landing. I've been trying to focus this on things that I've learned and people who have taught me. And that's why I can't really talk about New York a whole lot in a broad sense because there were so many of them. So like I said, the city taught me a lot. I can't talk about any of this stuff unless I talk about Kenneth McCoy. Kenneth McCoy was there at the very beginning with me at the Hudson, and he was there at every single major point of my life in New York until relatively recently. From the beginning to kind of the end of the beginning, to the middle, to the beginning of my own kind of branching out into the business on a whole different way, which is when I opened my own place with him and Abdul Tabini, and ultimately until I left. So he was kind of the reason I stayed, and he was the reason I left. That's a long story, and I'm certainly not going to get into it here. I don't know that I ever will. But Kenny taught me the city, and the city taught me a lot. So for that, I will always be in his debt, because he made me understand what someone who had grown up in this place, and actually, Kenny couldn't do this shit either. He probably could. Someone who had grown up in the business in that place, and kind of took this country mouse and showed him a whole different way and showed me like how to break the code, not just to bars, but bars in New York. And then, like I said, we had a whole thing. He was my best friend for many, many years and my finest collaborator and one of my best partners. So I'll leave it there. But after the Hudson, I went to a neighborhood called Tribeca, which a lot of you guys might know because of the World Trade Centers, because that's where those were. And 9/11 is a whole nother thing, too. We were working down there, and I worked in that neighborhood a long time, and that is where I met a guy named Abdul Tabini who worked at a place called the Odeon. And for all of those who have ever had a Cosmopolitan, the Odeon is where it was invented and kind of where it was popularized. So the Odeon was this kind of legendary place full of people and things that I knew nothing about. I grew up in a very different circumstance, and I didn't grow up around that kind of culture. Like culture with the big C. Going to places where Andy Warhol used to hang out, and Jean-Michel Basquiat used to hang out, and, you know, Dennis Hopper would... Dennis Hopper used to order takeout from, you know, all these kind of like bold-faced name things, which I wasn't super impressed by necessarily, but it was part of it. But the thing is, that was a neighborhood too, and that was a lesson as well. So it taught me very much that when you're the bartender, it doesn't matter who's on the other side. You still have a degree of control over a relationship that you don't have in everyday life. Tribeca was by the financial district, you know, so titans of industry would come in and hang out of our places. People that I knew for flip sure wouldn't say hi to me on the street, would come up and say, hey, let me introduce you to my friend Michael. And I'm like, well, I guess we're friends now, cool. And some of them became friends, you know. It didn't burn the class warrior out of me or something, but it gave me a different context of the possibilities of who you get to present yourself to be when you're behind the bar. So being around people like that and serving people like that can do two things to you. It can make you feel like a servant, or it can make you feel like not a servant. And I very, very much was not going to feel that way. So it kind of taught me that what you give is generally what you get. If you give friendly and confident, you generally get back friendly and confident. And, you know, you can't take any shit. It's still ringing like a bell. You know, you have to treat people with respect, and you have to insist that they treat everyone else with respect, including you. And that was a big lesson that I learned, and that was working around people who, given other circumstances, would not have treated me that way. And it doesn't necessarily make them bad people, it's just how the world works, right? And I didn't want to feel bad about what I did, and watching a lot of people around me, including people like Abdul, gave me insight into how I could make my own way in that world, and I could go and be confident in who I am as a human, and still work in a job whose literal description is to serve. I have a different understanding of that idea of service now maybe than I did then, but you know, I was young. I mean, I suppose I wasn't that young. So you guys can see, I'm going back to the spoon flare, but I'm gonna work a little bit on my left hand here because I'm still not a southpaw. I did it all the way around, yay. And see, if you remember, it starts down here on the bottom and flips up, 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 and around. Flair. You know, all of that led me to a bar called Grace, and Grace was one of my biggest learning moments because it was the first bar that I worked at. It was huge, and you had to be a rocket ship to work there. We made an enormous number of cocktails. We had fresh juices, and we had all of the setup, and that was very important to us. So we changed the menu, we did the whole thing, and this would have been, you know, after 9/11, so 2001. It was also 44 feet long, and it had over 400 spirits behind it. That's where I started to look at the possibilities of what was available in the world, even if it wasn't as widely available as it is now. Yeah, I mean, Grace was amazing, still one of the best bars I ever worked, and it was definitely a bartender's bar. And I'd always kind of worked in places like that, but not as thorough as what Grace was. You could get off work at 3:30 in the morning and rush down to this place, and as long as you got your food order in before 4 o'clock, that's 4 a.m., you could do 3:59 and get your burger order in. It might be the fastest burger you ever got in your life, but you could get that burger. So we knew all the bartenders because they all came to us because we were always there. And that was a lesson. And that's a lesson that I've taken into the places that I've opened. Where whatever you say you're going to do time-wise, do it. A lot of places will say, I know we're supposed to close at 1, but if no one's in here at midnight, then we'll close down early. I get it, and I'm the beneficiary of that because we're the ones who always stay, and we always stay open. If you're a destination bar and you say you're doing one thing and people show up one time and you don't do it, then they just made all this time and effort to go somewhere at a time when they just risked all these things, and they risked their idea of going somewhere else. So always be there. That's what I learned at Grace, and you know, it paid off in spades because the one thing that you want as a bartender is a clientele of bartenders. I learned how to be a bartender for bartenders, and that has served me well in so many ways, both as a manager, a trainer, an owner, and as a bartender myself. So, yeah. Let's get phone work here. We did the one with the bottle. Let's get the bottle out. Ooh, this will mix it up. This bottle has stuff in it. It's different when it's full. It's heavier. There we go. If I break this one, it's going to get messy. I'm still not doing this at the same time. Tribeca is its own story. Grace is its own story because it was amazing, but I learned so much, and I learned so much about cocktails and people, and that's where I learned how to do them fast. We were so fast, and we had to be. All these people and all this space, and there was only 2 of us. So anytime anyone says to me that you can't have a cocktail program without four wells in it, I kind of look back at those times and I'm like, hey, Ken, you just have to do it in a different way than you're used to. After Grace closed down, which was a sad, tragic day because I loved that bar, I ended up working at a bar called Macau Trading Company. Macau was the second bar of a place called Employees Only, which was one of the early kind of modern cocktail bars, hugely influential. I had kind of weaseled my way into their network because I lived right around the corner from there at the time. And, I wasn't nearly cool enough for those dudes because they were super cool at the time. But I was a good bartender, and Macau was in Tribeca. So just as things went, they hired me to do this opening, and that is where I met all the Employees Only people. So I was an oldish bartender at the time, and I was kind of set in my ways. So it was interesting for me to have to go back into someone else's network, and they had their own way of doing it. And I was crappy. I was shitty. I was like, I'm just not doing some of this stuff. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I just didn't do it. If you're really good, sometimes they'll kind of, they'll give you a break. They were amazing. They were good. They were fast. Their system and their training was amazing. Their setup was amazing. And they still Freeport, which for me was amazing because that's what I did. Which again, another conversation. I feel like this whole conversation about New York is just another conversation. I wasn't in Macau very long, but I was in the neighborhood long with them, like after I left there, and so still kept that relationship and still very much part of the family. Then I opened my own place, and I'm just gonna bookend this story like this. I opened my own place. It's called Ward 3. I did it with Kenneth McCoy and Abdul Tabini. Opened our second place, which was called the Rum House in the Edison Hotel. It was in Times Square, which all by itself was a lesson. Being around all those people and doing this kind of cocktail in that kind of neighborhood bar around all of these strangers taught me so much that I took so many other places. And then I left New York. That's a placeholder, and we'll kind of leave it there. And maybe one day we'll dive into the details of that, but not now. Oddly, after making a big deal about leaving and being so happy because I'm from the desert. I'm from Southern California. That's where I was born. So I was going to work in LA, and I didn't have to deal with New York winters anymore, which I hated. Oddly, I'd been in LA for a very short amount of time, and I got a phone call from someone who ultimately got me a job running a place called the Holiday Cocktail Lounge. So this was kind of a reboot of a dive bar. They wanted to do cocktails, but wanted to keep the dive bar kind of informality and that kind of sense of family and fun. And they called me, and we talked, and I got the job, and it was amazing. But I was commuting from Los Angeles to New York City on a regular basis, so once or twice a month. And a lot of the Holiday's still there, and it's still one of the best places that I've ever worked, and the place that I'm most proud of. It's also the place where I got to meet so many people from around the world as bartenders. It took us all over the place, taking our experience to other people, and it brought so many bartenders to one place. So again, being the bartender's bartender is a thing. It taught me the power of music and song, which we kind of knew already, but at Holiday we made it so much part of our program to say, this is what it's about. Empowered the bartenders to do that, and then forced everyone into a room and said, let's just all sing the same song together. And it was amazing. But the best thing about the Holiday, besides what we got to do, and besides getting to work with my brother, which is another story, his name's Neff, and we did a lot together, and watching him grow and blossom and become a bartender in his own right, and such an amazing bartender in his own right, was very gratifying. But I met a woman named Barbara Sibley, who had been in the East Village for a long time and had been in restaurants and bars for a good portion of her time in the city. Owned a restaurant right down the street, which is also still there, called La Palapa, which is a wonderful, traditional Mexican restaurant. And when I say traditional, I mean food like they make it in Mexico, not just some burritos. Barbara was one of the most insightful and most generous people I'd worked with in a long time, if not ever. She was amazing at thinking about everything from the shape of a room and how that affects people walking into it and how they feel, to very compassionately dealing with customers, dealing with any kind of issue, dealing with the clientele, just someone who was smart and experienced and was in many ways a mentor for me, because she was not a bar person necessarily, though her place definitely had bars. And she was not a cocktail person necessarily, though she could definitely work her way around a cocktail menu because she did it at her own place. But she showed me the power of humanity in management, how that bleeds out into a staff and how that kind of bleeds out into a clientele, And the amount of compassion she was able to display in so many circumstances taught me a lot. And she helped me kind of understand something and maybe intellectualize something that has affected a lot what I did moving forward. It's one thing to be creative, and it's one thing to be professional. It's one thing to be knowledgeable. It's one thing to be good at your job. And don't get me wrong, Barbara was all of those things in spades. And, so experienced and so, so insightful, like all those things. To be truly great, you kind of have to have a layer of compassion on top of all that stuff. Otherwise, you're just kind of in it for yourself. Being a bartender is kind of the definition of not being in something for yourself. Because you have a community to maintain. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing it as good as you can be doing it. So yeah, New York's tough because there was so much of it. So that kind of gets us up to relatively recently. I'm going to extend this part of the storytelling one more day. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the last part, which is kind of the West Coast and then Texas. The people that helped me in New York are all still around in some form or the other, even though they're not all in the business. And some of them I'm not really in contact with anymore, and I'm sad about that. But, going backwards, I want to thank Barbara Sibley for everything she did for me. And she still does, really, just in moral support, if nothing else. Regardless of what happened with Employees Only, and regardless of your opinion of what you think they became, there was a time when everyone there was very supportive of me, especially people like Igor. It's displaying gratitude, I guess, is a thing. JJ McCardle, who was one of my, who was my partner in crime at Grace. People like Fred McKibben and Michael Waterhouse, two kind of like unsung legends in the kind of cocktail game that you don't really hear about anymore. Abdul, who's someone I admired as a bartender for so long, and then became my partner when I opened my first bar. But most of all, I have an enormous amount of gratitude for Kenny McCoy. Regardless of where our relationship went, which is really our business, without him, I couldn't have done any of it. And I've got to have a fair amount of gratitude for that, because of all the people that taught me everything in this business that I know, Kenny is one of the people that has taught me the most. So, yeah. I appreciate you guys watching. This does lead to different videos where we talk about different kind of training. Most of it's bartender training, and it's not all me just sitting here trying to learn Flair. Though this is whatever stories come out of the stories that come out. So this is just a way for me to practice. I appreciate you all listening. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. It'll help us a lot because it's kind of the currency of the age we live in right now, and it helps us kind of see what content works and doesn't, and opens it up to an audience, a whole different level of people. In the podcast, you can go to see the Cottonmouth Club Presents on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever fine podcasts are displayed. But yeah, we're doing all kinds of stuff, and I'm always excited to be able to take the wisdom that has been given to me and to try to give it to other people. Some of it's mine, but most of it isn't. Most of it is stuff that, I learned from other people. And the people that I talked about today are some of those people. So if they gave it to me, I feel like the least I can do is give it to you. So I'm gonna keep working on my Flair. I feel like I've gotten better, like a little bit. I'm gonna keep bringing out my Flair. I'm gonna keep doing this until I can say I learned a new skill. In the meantime, I hope you're learning new skills too. And like I said, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate the fact that you're here, and I'll see you tomorrow. I hate the finger gun thing, so like that. Flair. I appreciate you paying attention. I appreciate all the support that we've gotten, and I will look forward to bringing more of this to you in the future, starting, let's say, maybe tomorrow. Okay. I appreciate you guys keeping me company while I'm learning a new skill, and I will be back tomorrow with a new thing to try to master. And in the meantime, I will practice, and I will hope that you guys will come back and say hi. So, thanks so much.